Hi everyone, it's Laura and I hope you're all really well. Today is the start of my end of year videos where we're looking back on everything I've read in 2019, which has come around quickly, hasn't it? I was just scrolling through my Goodreads earlier to try and work out what I've read over the course of the year, and it just feels like it has flown by. So I'm going to be filming my most disappointing, most surprising, worst and favourite books that I have read over the course of this year. So eventually, once they're all uploaded, they will be linked in the description box below if you'd like to see all of them. Today we're going to be talking about my most disappointing reads, and what I mean when I say disappointing is something that I had very high hopes for, and it just didn't really live up to them. Doesn't necessarily mean they're bad books, but books that maybe didn't fulfill their original promise. And the first book, which did not in any way, shape or form fulfill its promise to me, was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, this has been everywhere, all over BookTube. There's been a lot of hype. I think probably, to be fair, more so in the YA reading community than in the sort of adult booktube community. But I did go in with really high hopes, and I feel like my opinion of this book is actually still quite controversial. I haven't really seen that many people talking about how bad it is. This is the life story of a fictional film star, Evelyn Hugo, and a young journalist is invited to meet her to talk about her biography. She's giving away all of her secrets for the first time ever, and she talks about all of the 7 times she's been married. So each chapter looks at a different part in her life and a different husband. And through this confessional with this young journalist, you discover lots of things about Evelyn. You discover sort of who her real love of her life was, and you understand her link with this journalist Monique and why she's asked her to come there and give her life story. And as a premise, I thought that was interesting, very enjoyable. I really loved the way Taylor Jenkins Reid imagined this alternative Hollywood, because I do listen to Karina Longworth's podcast, You Must Remember This, which gives you backstory of different movie stars, but the different movies they were making, who they were sleeping with, and it's really interesting piecing it together. And I do think she did a really good job of creating this alternate Hollywood with different stars and giving you the full career projection of Evelyn Hugo. I thought that was done quite well, actually, but in general, the writing was very poor. There was so much exposition. The way Monique was thinking about what Evelyn was telling her and then going home and being like, you know what, I think that applies to my life, because when Evelyn said this, that is really similar to this thing that's happening in my life. And it was like, wow, hit me over the head with it, why don't you? And the other thing I thought was handled quite badly was the LGBT side of it, which in theory would have been a really, really good part of this book. And it's really interesting looking at how film stars had to be closeted during that time. And I think that had so much potential, and yet it was just handled so clumsily. And again, just kind of shoehorned in there, like Evelyn Hugo and her friends happening to be in New York, literally at the exact time of the Stonewall riots, and like seeing it happen. I just thought she lives in LA, like this is so unlikely that she would be there. So I just felt it was very, pretty badly written, to be fair. I have 5 books to talk about in this video. They're not in any particular order, but number 2 in this list is Just Kids by Patti Smith. And especially with this book, I don't mean to say it was a bad read necessarily. It just wasn't what I expected, but maybe my expectations on this book were quite, maybe that's my fault. But I feel like when a lot of people talk about this book, they talk about how inspiring it is. And I just really didn't get that. So Patti Smith, who I didn't know very much about before reading the book, to be fair, is obviously a sort of rock star, but also poet and writer. And this is about her relationship with the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe when they were young in New York. And it's just looking at this specific period in her life, really, when they were young and poor and just trying to become someone. And that side of it was interesting. I liked hearing about what New York was like in the 60s. I think especially now we get a bit of a perspective that the 60s were really cool and free and all this amazing stuff was happening. And when you see it from someone's point of view who's living through it, you realise that actually it was quite a scary time. Lots of people were getting assassinated. Like it was very turbulent to live through. And I think that really came across. What I didn't really like about the book was the amount of name dropping that Patti Smith does throughout without really explaining who these people are. And okay, fair enough, I know who Andy Warhol is, but lots of people weren't really explained, and I don't know if I should have known who they were or if they're quite niche. And equally, the only real relationship that's elaborated upon is her relationship with Robert, and when she's with other people in relationships or has friends or she's staying with different people, they just seem to come out of nowhere. And I didn't really understand if she had any other friends other than Robert, because she didn't really sort of expand upon that. And I think ultimately, because of my age probably, and because I don't really work in a creative industry, when they were deciding to like buy art supplies and not eat, I was like, you are idiots. I know they didn't have very much money, but I just didn't understand why they had to be poor and not have money, and why they couldn't just get a job. Like, I really, really struggled with it. And I know they were very young and idealistic and artists and everything, but I was like, you should probably eat though. Like, surely that's like number one priority, eating and having a roof over your head. So I kind of couldn't get on board with it. But as a book talking about creating art for art's sake and not really knowing where you're going with your art, not necessarily having a direction. Patti Smith never thought she'd release an album. That wasn't sort of her main purpose. She was just writing poems, which turned out to be sort of lyrics. So in that sense, I can see the appeal of it. But overall, I just think it was going to be like life-changing, and it did not change my life. Number 3 is one of our feminist orchestra picks for this year, so I'm very sorry, and that was Dead Girls by Alice Berlin. This is a collection of essays supposedly about the concept of the dead girl. So like in media, when we talk about murder stories, for example, either like real life murders or just in TV shows and in stories where like there's the plot is strewn with bodies of dead girls, but we don't really understand about them as characters. It's more about in order to push the story forward of the male detective that's solving the case, and etc, etc. And it sounded really interesting. And the essay on that concept was quite interesting, but a lot of the other essays had nothing to do with that. And most of it was about her moving to LA and thinking she was really cool, is all that I can understand. And a lot of it evolved into literary criticism, and looking at what specifically Joan Didion had written about LA, and then her going, well, Joan says this about this road, but now that I've been on that road, I think this. And I've not been to LA and I've not read Joan Didion, so I got very little from those essays. It didn't really seem to add very much to any kind of conversation, and the collection didn't really flow. Like the essays didn't really link together. It was just disappointing, basically, because there was a couple of essays in there which were quite good, but the majority of it were just not on the theme that, you know, the title implies and also the blurb implies. So number 4 was The Keeper by Jessica Moore. I read this quite recently, and I'm just disappointed with it because I really wanted it to be a good book, and it also really had the potential to be great as well. But again, just the writing let it down, although I think this was a debut novel, so perhaps I will cut it a little bit of slack. This is a thriller trying to solve the murder of a young woman who worked in a women's refuge, whose body has been found in a local suicide spot, but all of the women who worked with her or are staying in the refuge don't believe it could be suicide. And so we have this dual narrative where we jump between her and her relationship with this guy, and how that develops, and then the present day while the police are trying to solve her murder. And in terms of the actual plotting, I thought this was fantastic. Like the analysis of how domestic abuse grows in relationships, I thought that was really well handled, and like the actual twists and turns of the story I thought were great. But just the way the different women, specifically the different women in the refuge, how they were portrayed and handled, I thought was very messy. There was a lot of exposition, and I didn't really believe any of their stories enough. I don't know, I don't think we really got to know them properly. There was a lot of stereotyping in there, I think, which isn't like necessarily about, it depends how you handle it, but I just don't think it was handled well enough. And there are a couple of chapters written from the perspective of one of the women in the refuge who is, I think she was a drug addict, an ex-prostitute, and she was sort of running away, and these were written sort of really scatterly and almost like a stream of consciousness and thinking about all these different things, but the writing just wasn't good enough to really work. I could see what she was trying to do. It's like she was trying to be really kind of experimental and cool with her writing, but those chapters were just rubbish. So that was a bit of a shame. But in general, it had so much potential. I just want to like wring this book's neck. It was just disappointing, which is the theme of the video, which is, you know, why it's in this list. And number 5, the last book I found disappointing this year, was a controversial one, but that was The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. It's very difficult to not find something like this disappointing because there was just so much hype surrounding this book. So I will, you know, I will give it that, but I think even on top of the hype, I still found it a little bit disappointing. This was a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, set 16 years-ish after the events in the book, and it was very interesting, I think, as a companion piece to The Handmaid's Tale. If you really, really love that book, and then I think you might get quite a lot out of this one. It's told from 3 different people's perspectives rather than just Offred's, and you see the perspective of Aunt Lydia, a girl who's living in Canada, and a girl who has grown up within Gilead. So in that sense, it was really interesting when you have one of these crazy totalitarian states, seeing the perspectives of someone who is enforcing the law in that state, someone who's just grown up in it, and someone who's never lived in it and is looking at it from the outside. From that angle, I thought that was really good. But in terms of the plot, I just felt like too much of it was a follow-on from what happened in the TV show. If you'd seen the show, I felt like what was being revealed to you wasn't really new. And if something was supposed to be a twist or surprising, I was like, well, I guessed that ages ago because I've seen the show. So I wasn't, it felt quite lazy. But I don't know if maybe if you just read The Handmaid's Tale and then just read this and hadn't seen the TV series at all, perhaps you would get a little bit more from it. Maybe, I don't know, but it just didn't seem kind of good enough. I didn't feel like she was saying more than she'd said already with The Handmaid's Tale. So this book as a standalone book, I didn't think was good enough to like win the Man Booker Prize, etc. I think like if you're going to award it for The Handmaid's Tale, you should have done that like 30 years ago. But, you know, it wasn't a bad read. I think it just was hyped up so much and it was just impossible for it to live up to that hype, to be fair. But even with an allowance for that, I felt like the book itself was just fine. It was good, I enjoyed it, but like, did it like add any more to my Handmaid's Tale experience? Like, I don't really think so. So we've started on some bad news. My next video is going to be my 5 most surprising reads of the year, which will be a good thing, because that's books I didn't have very high expectations of and turned out to really enjoy. So, you know, it's okay. It's a bit of a shit sandwich situation we've got going on here, but that's all good. I would love to hear from you if you read any of these books. And also, what books did you find disappointing this year? Were there any that came out which had a load of hype, which you were really disappointed by? Let me know in the comments below and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!